I told my mother that my stepfather was coming into my room at night, touching me when she was on her night shift. I wrote her a letter because I was too scared to say it out loud. She never opened it. 2 days later, she slapped me and called me a liar. My name is Gloria Ann Sullivan. I'm 80 years old, and for most of my life, I carried the weight of a letter I wrote as a teenage girl, trying to escape the abuse no one wanted to believe. Decades later, I found that letter still sealed, and for the first time, I read it aloud. To someone who did believe me. Have you ever spoken the truth only to be silenced? Leave a comment. Someone out there may need to know they're not alone. Every morning, just after I wake up, and before I put on my slippers, I look at the frame on my living room wall. It's not a big frame. Just walnut wood slightly faded at the corners. The kind of thing you'd pass by in someone's hallway without a second glance. But it holds the letter I wrote when I was 14. A letter that sat unread for 66 years. A letter my mother never opened. Some folks keep family photos above their fireplace. Weddings, babies, maybe a diploma or two. I keep a letter. Folded 3 times, still yellowed from time and humidity now pressed behind clean glass. I guess I framed it not because it's beautiful, but because it's mine. My voice trapped on paper when my voice couldn't be heard aloud. My daughter Karen once asked, "Why do you hang on to that, Mom? Doesn't it just make you sad?" But it doesn't make me sad, not anymore. Not the way it used to. It reminds me I survived. Sometimes when the house is quiet and the kettle's warming up, I sit on the couch and stare at that letter. My hands are older now, lined and slower, but I remember writing each word like it happened yesterday. I remember the feeling of the pen slipping slightly in my hand. I remember holding my breath as I folded it, slid it into the pocket of my mother's nurse's coat, and prayed that she would read it. She never did. I suppose it's strange to begin a story at the end. Most folks would start in the spring of things when everything is fresh and full of promise. But I'm starting here at the frame on my wall because that's where the silence finally broke. That's where my story turned from survival into something stronger. My name is Gloria Ann Sullivan. I'm 80 years old. I live alone in Portland, Maine, in a modest house with creaky steps and hydrangeas that bloom faithfully every summer. I have one daughter, Karen, who calls every Sunday without fail, and a granddaughter, Emily, who once told me I make the best tea in the world. I've never remarried. Never moved too far from where I grew up. The world kept turning, and I kept living quietly, carefully for a long time. But that letter, that forgotten, unopened thing, was never quiet. Not really. It rustled in the drawers of my memory. It whispered in the corners of my life. And when I found it again after my mother passed, it screamed. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but sometimes the smallest things make the loudest noise. An old song on the radio, a particular perfume, a folded piece of paper left in a box no one thought to open. It's funny, isn't it, how the past finds its way back? I didn't plan to keep the letter. When I first held it again, my instinct was to rip it up or maybe burn it, to finally let it go. But my hands wouldn't do it. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and read it. For the very first time. I don't know why I never reread it until then. Maybe I was scared it would sound like the rambling of a dramatic teenager. Maybe I worried it would feel silly. But it didn't. It was raw, honest, careful. 14-year-old me had chosen each word with hope. Hope that someone would see. Hope that someone would care. She didn't. 2 days after I slipped the letter into my mother's coat, she slapped me. Hard. I remember her exact words. "Don't make up stories to ruin my life." That was it. No questions, no hesitation, just anger. And that night when he came into my room again, he smiled. "She chose me," he whispered. I learned something that night, not about danger or fear. I already knew those things. What I learned was how easily the world could decide who mattered and who didn't. I learned what it meant to be invisible, even while standing right in front of someone. But I'm not invisible now. Now, I sit in a warm room wrapped in a quilt my grandmother made with a letter on my wall that no longer haunts me. It doesn't scream anymore. It speaks. To anyone who visits it might just look like a piece of paper. But to me, it's a voice that wasn't lost. A part of me that never gave up. And maybe, if you've ever felt small or silenced or like your truth didn't matter, you'll understand why I kept it, why I framed it, why I chose to begin this story not with the girl I was, but with the woman I've become. Because that's where it starts. Not with the silence, but with the choice to break it. And now, if you're willing, I'll take you back. Back to the coldest winter I remember. Back to the first time he walked through our door. The winter of 1956 arrived early in our little town of Hollow Pines. By mid-November, snow had already blanketed the sidewalks, and icicles hung from the eaves like teeth. I was 14 that year, and the cold seemed sharper, somehow more biting than the winters before. Or maybe I just remember it that way, because it's the year everything started to change. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town with peeling green shutters and a crooked mailbox. Our heater wheezed when it kicked in, and the windows rattled when the wind howled too hard. But it was home. My mother, Evelyn, worked night shifts at the local hospital. She'd leave at 10 p.m. in her starched white uniform, her lipstick always perfect, her hair pinned tight, not a strand out of place. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made people pause when she passed. And I was quiet. Always had been. I spent more time with books than with people. I liked to bake pies and listen to the radio. I helped with the laundry and looked after my little sister Lucy when I had to. I wasn't remarkable. I was just a good girl. Or so I thought. That was the year Walter came. I remember the day my mother introduced him. It was a Saturday. She had curled her hair and baked cinnamon rolls from scratch, which she only did when she wanted to make a good impression. Lucy and I sat at the kitchen table, confused but curious. "Girls," she said, smoothing her skirt and gesturing toward the tall man standing awkwardly near the doorway. "This is Mr. Walter Briggs. He and I have been keeping company." Walter gave a half smile and nodded. "Nice to meet you both." He had a long face, pale eyes, and a neat mustache. Something about him made me want to fold in on myself, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was how he didn't quite meet my eyes. Or maybe it was how he kept staring just a little too long. I told myself I was imagining it. Mama was all smiles that afternoon. She served him coffee in the good china and laughed at his jokes, most of which weren't very funny. Lucy liked him right away. He brought her a puzzle, and she was easy to win over. But I stayed quiet, watching, noting every glance. Within a month, he was staying over, and not long after, his things started appearing in the hallway closet. Mama said it was practical. "He helps around the house," she explained. "And with me working nights, it's good to have a man here. For your safety." The way she said it made it sound like a favor, like she was thinking of us. But I felt less safe than I ever had. Walter had a way of making himself too comfortable too fast. He'd sit in Daddy's old armchair like it had always belonged to him. He started calling Lucy Sweet Pea and telling me to smile more. "You're too serious for your age, Gloria," he'd say, ruffling my hair like I was a dog. I hated it. I hated how my mother's eyes lit up when he brought her flowers. How she overlooked the way he walked into our rooms without knocking. How she brushed off my discomfort like it was nothing. "He's just trying to be friendly," she said once when I mentioned how he watched me when I walked up the stairs. "But I don't like it," I whispered. "You're being dramatic," she replied. "He's part of the family now." And just like that, it was decided. It was around that time the temperature dropped below 0 for 3 nights in a row. The windows fogged up so thick we had to scrape the inside with rags just to see outside. Mama was working the overnight shift more often, and Walter was the one tucking us in. He brought me hot cocoa one night and sat on the edge of my bed for just a moment too long. When he finally stood up, he said, "Good girls don't keep secrets from their mamas." It wasn't a threat, not quite, but it wasn't nothing. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind push against the walls. My room, once warm and familiar, felt foreign. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and tried to make myself smaller. That winter, our town hosted its annual tree lighting ceremony in the square. People gathered with scarves wrapped up to their noses, sipping cider and singing carols. Mama went with Walter, wearing a red coat I hadn't seen before. They looked like a picture-perfect couple. She smiled more than I had seen in years. I stayed home with Lucy, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. She fell asleep in my lap, warm and peaceful. And I remember thinking, this is how quiet danger begins, not with shouting, but with silence. That was the beginning of the coldest season in my life, not because of the snow, but because of what was growing in the shadows of our house. No one saw it. No one asked. And I was just a girl with no voice living in a town where people smiled politely and never asked what went on behind closed doors. The first night she didn't come home, the house sounded different. The heater had a soft wheeze, same as always, but the space between each groan felt longer. The ticking clock in the hallway was too loud. Even Lucy's soft breathing from the bed across the room seemed to echo. I lay awake, watching the ceiling blanket pulled up to my chin, trying to ignore the cold settling into my bones. Mama's voice wasn't in the house that night. No sound of her setting down her keys, no rustle of her coat, no gentle closing of the medicine cabinet in the bathroom down the hall. She had picked up an extra shift at the hospital. A nurse had called in sick, and Mama never said no to overtime. She needed the money, and I knew that. But I also knew something else, that Walter would be home. Alone. With us. He said goodnight like he always did. "Sleep tight, girls," and closed the door behind him. At least I thought he did. I heard the click, but clicks can be undone. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the thin curtains. Lucy was already asleep, one hand curled beneath her cheek, breathing slow and soft. I envied her innocence. At 7, she trusted the world. She still believed that all grown-ups told the truth, and monsters only lived under beds, not in hallways. I tried to sleep. I closed my eyes and counted backwards from 100. I pictured warm places. I told myself that everything was fine, that Walter would stay in his room, that the shadows were just shadows. But then I heard the floorboard, not the usual creak of a house settling in the cold. This was different, slow, deliberate moving toward our room. One step, then another. I held my breath. The door opened, just a few inches, just enough to let in the faintest slice of hallway light. My heart thudded so hard, I thought it might wake Lucy. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Walter stood there. He didn't say a word, just leaned against the doorframe like he belonged there. I could barely see him, but I felt his presence pushing into the room like fog. And then he stepped inside. He crossed the floor slowly, his socks making no sound on the wooden boards. He paused between our beds, looking down at both of us. I squeezed my eyes shut, tried to keep my breathing steady. I didn't want him to know I was awake. He knelt beside me. I felt the air shift. He didn't touch me. Not that night. But he leaned in close, so close I could smell his breath. "Coffee and cigarettes. You're so quiet," he whispered. "That's good. Good girls stay quiet." He stood up and left just as slowly as he came. The door clicked shut. This time, I heard it. I didn't move for a long time after that. I stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling again, only now I wasn't counting numbers. I was counting heartbeats. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally rose and light spilled into the room, it felt unreal, like the world had forgotten what happened in the dark. Mama came home just before breakfast. She looked tired, her uniform wrinkled, her shoes damp from snow. She kissed Lucy's forehead and asked how we slept. I lied. Fine. She smiled, poured herself a cup of coffee, and hummed a tune from the radio. I watched her move around the kitchen like nothing had changed, but everything had. That day at school, I barely spoke. My teacher, Miss Dotson, asked if I was feeling all right. I said yes. She tilted her head and looked at me a second longer than usual, but she didn't push. No one ever pushed. When I got home that afternoon, Walter was in the kitchen. He had made cocoa again. My cup had extra marshmallows. For the quiet one, he said with a wink. I nodded, took the cup, and went straight to my room. I poured it down the sink when no one was looking. That night, I rearranged my pillows so they faced the wall. I wrapped Lucy's arm around mine and held it tight, as if her small hand could protect me. She didn't even stir. She never knew. But I knew. I knew that silence wasn't just something you sat in. It was something that wrapped around you like a second skin. Something that muffled your steps and stole your breath. Something that trained you to walk lightly, to avoid eye contact, to apologize, even when you weren't sure what for. That was the night I stopped speaking my fears aloud. And it was also the night I began writing things down. I don't remember exactly what made me decide to write the letter that afternoon. Maybe it was the way Walter smiled at me at breakfast. Maybe it was the way my mother didn't notice how my hand shook when I handed her the salt. Maybe it was the silence piling up in my chest, building like snow on a roof waiting to cave in. What I do remember is the feeling tight, urgent, like something inside me couldn't stay quiet anymore. I needed her to see, to believe me, to protect me. So I sat at my little desk after school in the fading light of a gray January afternoon, and I began to write. I used the purple ink pen Mama had given me for Christmas. She said it was just for writing nice things, poems, and thank you notes. But that day, it was for truth. I didn't know how to begin. How do you tell your mother that the man she brings flowers to, the one who fixes the leaky faucet and watches her favorite shows beside her, turns into something else when the lights go out? I didn't write it directly. I was only 14, and the words felt dangerous, heavy. Instead, I told her I felt uncomfortable. I said Walter came into my room sometimes, that he looked at me in a way that made my stomach twist, that I was scared. I ended with, I don't want to ruin anything. I just want you to see me. It wasn't long, maybe 6 sentences total, but it took me an hour to write. I kept stopping to breathe, to listen for footsteps, to glance at Lucy asleep on the bed. I wrote carefully, like the ink might vanish if I moved too fast. When I finished, I folded the letter 3 times, once down, once over, once again, and slipped it into the inside pocket of Mama's nurse's coat, the one she always wore on her night shifts. I waited until she was brushing her hair in the bathroom. My heart pounded so loud, I thought she might hear it through the walls. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, rehearsing how she might react. Maybe she'd cry. Maybe she'd sit beside me on the bed, pull me into her arms, and whisper, "I'm so sorry, baby. I didn't know." I imagined her holding my hand and saying, "Thank you for telling me." I imagined her choosing me. The next morning, I waited. She got home just after sunrise, the smell of antiseptic clinging to her coat. She poured coffee, checked on Lucy, then sat down across from me at the table. Her eyes were tired but sharp. I thought, she's read it, she knows. But she didn't say anything. Just looked at me, then looked away. I went to school with a lump in my throat so big I couldn't speak. My heart held on to hope. Maybe she was waiting for the right moment. Maybe she was planning how to handle it. 2 days passed, and then it happened. I was helping fold laundry in the living room. Mama picked up her coat from the chair, shook it out, and something fluttered to the floor. The letter. Still folded. Still closed. She stared at it. My breath caught. She picked it up, turned it over in her hand, then looked at me. What is this? I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but the words stuck. She unfolded it, glanced at the first line, just the first, and then something in her face changed. Her lips went tight. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't read the rest. She crumpled the paper in her fist and crossed the room in 3 quick steps. You little liar, she hissed. How dare you make up stories about him? I backed away, bumping into the coffee table. I just wanted— You wanted attention, she snapped. That's what this is. You want to destroy the one good thing in my life. And then she slapped me. It wasn't the first time she'd lost her temper. But it was the first time I felt the pain deeper than skin. It landed not just on my cheek, but in the center of my chest. Not because it hurt, but because it meant she'd chosen. She walked away without another word, left the letter crumpled on the floor. I stood there stunned, hearing only the buzz of the heater and the ticking of the wall clock. That night, I didn't speak to her at dinner. I barely ate. Lucy chattered about her drawing from school, oblivious. Walter chewed slowly, watching me. His lips curled into a smile so faint it could have been a twitch. He didn't say anything, but when I went to bed, the door opened again. He stepped inside, calm and sure, and leaned close to whisper, She chose me. Then he left, and I folded in on myself, smaller than I'd ever been. After the slap, there was no yelling, no grounding, no further punishment, just silence. Mama didn't mention the letter again. She didn't explain. She didn't ask questions. She didn't even throw it away in front of me. It disappeared, tucked into some drawer, I assumed, and the subject vanished as quickly as it had surfaced. But the silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was the kind that spreads like spilled ink. It crept into every room, every conversation, every glance. It was the silence of things that had been decided final and heavy. That week, she cooked my favorite dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, and asked me about school like nothing had happened. I answered politely, my voice smaller than usual. She smiled when I said I got a B+ in math. I wondered if she even remembered what she'd done. Or if she'd buried it the way she buried other things, behind lipstick, behind nurses' uniforms, behind her need for a man beside her. Walter acted like the slap never happened either. He was all calm confidence, wearing a freshly ironed shirt and humming as he shaved in the bathroom. He greeted me with that same smirking tone, morning sweetheart. But something had shifted inside me. I began to move differently. I walked quietly, spoke less, kept my eyes down. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer that way. I started studying harder, clinging to my books like life jackets. When I wasn't reading, I was cleaning, folding, baking, trying to disappear into usefulness. Mama didn't notice. Or if she did, she called it maturity. She's growing up so fast, she told our neighbor Mrs. Ellison over coffee one day. She's always been such a good girl. Mrs. Ellison nodded. She's quiet, like her daddy was. I flinched when I heard that. Daddy had died when I was 6. I remembered the sound of his voice, low and gentle. I remembered the way he'd put his hand on my shoulder and squeeze it once, just enough to let me know I was safe. Walter's hands never felt like that. One afternoon, I sat on the front steps after school, a book in my lap, though I wasn't really reading. The sun was out for the first time in days, but it felt cold anyway. Lucy played with chalk on the sidewalk, drawing crooked hearts and stick figures in purple and blue. She smiled at me and said, "You don't draw anymore." I shrugged. She scooted closer. "Are you sad?" I looked down at her small hands, the chalk dust smeared across her knees. I wanted to tell her everything, to warn her, to protect her. But she was still a child. still living in a world where mama's kisses meant safety and grown-ups were always right. "I'm just tired," I said. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at myself under the yellow light. My face looked older than it had the month before. My eyes looked different, less open, less curious. I whispered, "Maybe if I'm quiet enough, I'll disappear." And in many ways I did. At school, I became the girl who always turned in her homework early, who kept her hands folded on her desk, who smiled just enough to avoid questions. My teachers praised me for being polite and dependable. One even gave me a note to bring home that said, "Gloria is a delight, mature beyond her years." I wanted to laugh. At home, I moved like smoke through hallways, through dinners, through weekends. I kept Lucy entertained, kept the laundry folded, kept Walter at arm's length with cold civility. He stopped sitting on the edge of my bed. He didn't need to anymore. He had won. And Mama seemed satisfied. Sometimes late at night, I heard her laugh in the kitchen. Walter's voice joined hers low and amused, like they were sharing a joke the world wouldn't understand. I would press my pillow against my ears and imagine a different house. One where the letter had been read, where she had believed me, where her arms had pulled me in and shielded me instead of pushing me further into silence. But I knew better than to dream for long. Instead, I counted days. I counted until I could leave, until I could turn 18, until I could apply for scholarships and get far away. Each day was a tiny mark on an invisible calendar, a quiet rebellion, a vow I kept tucked behind every "yes, ma'am" and every "I'm fine." Because I wasn't fine. I was silent, but I wasn't gone. Not yet. At school, I was the kind of student teachers liked to mention in the staff room. Polite, they'd say. Quiet, focused, such a lovely girl. I got good grades, never spoke out of turn, and always turned in my homework early, sometimes too early. But what they didn't see was that school had become more than just a place to learn. It was a shelter, a pause in the storm. For 6 hours a day, I could breathe without watching over my shoulder. I sat near the window in homeroom's second row from the back. I liked it there. It let me look out at the courtyard when things felt too loud. It let me avoid Walter's voice in my memory and my mother's silence in my chest. My best subject was English. I liked reading about people who lived louder lives than mine. Characters who yelled and cried and ran and dared. I wrote essays with metaphors I didn't fully understand, but felt deeply. My teacher, Miss Dotson, always left kind comments in the margins, beautiful phrasing, such insight. "You should consider writing more, Gloria." I never showed her the pages I wrote at night. Those pages weren't for grades. They were for survival. After everyone had gone to bed and the house fell into that eerie quiet, I'd take out a small notebook I kept hidden behind the dresser and write letters I'd never send. To Mama, to Walter, to the girl I used to be. Sometimes I didn't write at all. I just drew empty boxes. One for every day I didn't speak the truth. By the time spring came, the notebook was nearly full. At school, my only friend, if you could call her that, was Rachel. She sat beside me in science and sometimes walked with me to the bus. She liked lip gloss and talking about the older boys who worked part-time at the gas station. I listened, nodded, smiled in the right places. One day in early March, she turned to me during lunch and said, "You never talk about your family. Is your mom strict or something?" I hesitated. "She works a lot." "That new guy living with you, Walter, right? He's kinda creepy." I froze. She noticed. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything. I just saw him pick you up once. He didn't wave or anything, just stared." I swallowed hard and shrugged. "He's quiet." Rachel tilted her head. "You okay?" I smiled. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded, satisfied enough. But she never brought it up again. That was the thing about most people, they didn't want real answers. They wanted clean ones. One afternoon, Miss Dotson pulled me aside after class. The room had emptied, the walls still echoing with the chatter of students. She closed the door gently and leaned on the edge of her desk. "You've been different lately," she said softly. I looked at the floor. "You still do excellent work," she added. "But there's something behind your eyes. Something heavy. Are you all right, Gloria?" I didn't answer right away. Her voice was kind, too kind. It made my eyes sting. I focused on the chalk smudges near her elbow. "I'm fine," I whispered. She didn't press, just nodded slowly. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here. You don't have to carry it alone, whatever it is." I nodded back and gathered my books. But I didn't go to her again. Because I didn't know how to explain something that lived in silences and shadows. Something that didn't leave bruises you could point to. That week, Mama signed me up for church choir. She said I needed something joyful in my routine. I didn't argue. I went every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, stood in the back, and sang just loud enough to be heard, but never enough to stand out. One Thursday, as I waited outside for Mama to pick me up, Walter's truck pulled into the lot instead. He rolled down the window. "Your mom got held up. Hop in." I hesitated. "It's cold," he said, more a statement than concern. I climbed in. The ride home was quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't touch me. But the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. As we pulled into the driveway, he looked at me and said, "You're doing a good job keeping quiet." My fingers curled into fists in my lap. He smiled faintly. "That's what good girls do." That night, I sat on the floor of my room and stared at the full moon outside the window. I remembered something Rachel had said once. "You always seem like you're hiding behind something." She was right. I was hiding behind everything. It was late April when the kitchen clock stopped ticking. I remember because it happened on a Wednesday, Mama's third night shift in a row. The snow had melted weeks ago, but the chill still crept into our house, clinging to the walls like memory. The cherry trees in town had just begun to bloom, but inside, it still felt like February. The clock above the sink had been there since before I could write my name. Brown frame, off-white face, black hands. The second hand always ticked too loudly, but it was comforting somehow, steady, predictable. Until it wasn't. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I'd had trouble every night lately, but this time felt different. My skin prickled like the air had changed. Lucy had already turned over twice in her bed, murmuring something about birds in her dreams. I stayed still, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house. At 11:07 p.m., I heard the fridge hum. At 11:10, I heard Walter's footsteps. At 11:12, the hallway light flicked on. And then silence. No second-hand ticking, just stillness. I stared at the ceiling and counted. 1, 2, 3. Still nothing. The clock had stopped. And then so did my breath. His knock was soft, like he wanted me to think he wasn't there. But I knew. I always knew. I could feel him behind the door. "Gloria," he said, voice low. "I need to check the windows. Mama said one was left open." That was a lie. I knew it. He knew I knew it. I didn't answer. I curled tighter under the blanket, willing myself to disappear. The door opened anyway. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light behind him. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a man in a flannel shirt holding a lie in one hand and silence in the other. He walked to the window and jiggled the lock as if he really cared whether it was closed. Then he turned and looked at me. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "Nobody's here but us." Exactly, I thought. Nobody. That was the problem. I didn't say a word. Didn't move. I stared past him to the wall, to anything but his eyes. He waited, a second too long. Then he left. When the door closed, I couldn't breathe right away. It felt like my lungs had forgotten how. I got out of bed barefoot on the cold wood floor and walked to the kitchen. I needed water. I needed something to remind me I was real. The kitchen light was dim, just the little bulb over the stove. I poured a glass of water with shaky hands, trying not to make noise. Then I saw the clock. It was stuck at 11:12. I stared at it, frozen. It felt like a sign. like the house itself had given up. Time had stopped and left me behind. I sat down at the table and pressed my hand to the cool surface. I wanted to scream. I wanted someone to come, but no one did. The house was still. Lucy was asleep. Mama was gone. Walter was behind his door, humming faintly to a tune only he seemed to know. And I was there somewhere between a girl and a shadow. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote just 3 words. No one came. Then I tore out the page, folded it once, and tucked it beneath the kitchen clock. Maybe I thought if the clock started again, the words would matter. It didn't. In the morning, the hands still hadn't moved. Mama came home at 6:30, looking tired, and carrying a bag of cinnamon rolls from the hospital cafeteria. She didn't notice the clock. Didn't ask why I looked pale. She smiled, kissed Lucy's forehead, and said, "Good girls don't need checking on." I looked at her for a long time, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman who brushed my hair before school or made grilled cheese cut diagonally. I saw someone who didn't look back when I needed her to. The clock stayed broken for 2 weeks. Then one day, without fanfare, Mama replaced it with a newer model. The old one went into the attic next to boxes of photographs and winter coats, but I never forgot the time it stopped ticking. 11:12. The exact moment I realized I was on my own. Mama died in early spring. The daffodils had just started to bloom outside the kitchen window, bright and stubborn. It was a quiet passing. No hospital beeps, no last-minute confessions. Just one final breath in her sleep and the silence that followed. Karen flew in from Boston. Neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. The pastor said comforting things that floated over my head like birds I couldn't name. Everyone asked how I was doing. "I'm fine," I said. She went peacefully. But peace wasn't the word I would have chosen. After the service, I wandered the house like a ghost, my childhood home still creaking in all the same places. Lucy, now living 2 states away, had called, but wouldn't come. "Too many memories," she said. I understood. We all carried our silences differently. It wasn't until 3 days later, while sorting through boxes in the attic, that I found the letter. The attic smelled like cedar and old books. Dust coated everything, cardboard boxes labeled in Mama's cursive faded Christmas ornaments, my father's worn leather suitcase. I moved carefully, my knees aching, as I knelt beside a trunk I hadn't seen in decades. Inside were old aprons, a pair of white gloves, a broken music box, and at the very bottom, a wrinkled manila envelope. No name. Just folded edges and the faint scent of lavender soap. I opened it slowly, and there it was. The letter, my letter, still folded in thirds. Still creased at the same spots where my nervous fingers had pressed it 66 years ago. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I held it like it might vanish. I unfolded it, hands shaking, and read the words I'd written at 14. "Dear Mama, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but I feel scared when Walter is here. He looks at me when you're gone. Sometimes he comes into my room at night. I don't know what to do. Please, just see me. Love, Gloria." That was it. Simple, honest, small, and she had never read it. The crease was unbroken. The ink had barely faded. The paper was worn only at the edges, untouched where it mattered. She had never opened it. I sat back against an old armchair, the letter trembling in my hands. The attic was quiet, except for the soft tapping of tree branches against the roof. I felt 14 again, cold, invisible, waiting for a rescue that never came. But then something unexpected rose in me, not grief, not even anger. Just a strange, hollow clarity. It hadn't been about truth. It had been about choice. She chose not to see me, even with the letter in her pocket, even with the words in her hands. She chose not to open it. And now, decades later, I was the one holding it. I looked around the attic, this dusty museum of our family's life, and felt a stillness I hadn't known in years. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of echoes I finally recognized as mine. I pressed the letter to my chest, and I whispered to the rafters, "I see you, Gloria. I see you." That night, back at my house, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. Karen had gone to bed worn out from helping with arrangements and phone calls. The dishes were clean. The dog next door barked once, then fell quiet. I stared at the letter again. I could have buried it, burned it, let it return to the silence it had lived in for 6 decades. But I didn't. I reached for a frame in the hallway closet, an old one I had saved from a yard sale years ago, not knowing what I'd ever use it for. I carefully smoothed the letter, lined it up behind the glass, and sealed it shut. It wasn't perfect. The paper curled slightly at one corner. A small stain in the upper margin hadn't faded. But it was mine, and now it would hang where I could see it, where others could too. Not as proof, not as revenge, but as a witness, a quiet, steady reminder of the voice I found again, starting with the words of a scared girl who dared to speak. I had never read the letter aloud, not once, not when I found it in the attic, not in the quiet of my bedroom, not even in the still hours of the night when everything in the house held its breath. The words had lived inside me, curled like a shell around old pain. I had memorized them, but I had never let them fill the room. Until the afternoon Karen came to visit. It was a Sunday, the kind of spring day that still smelled faintly of winter. She brought fresh rolls from the bakery and daisies in a mason jar. She always brought something, as if trying to make up for the years she didn't know I was holding something heavy. She walked into the living room, paused in front of the frame above the fireplace, and asked, "Not for the first time, Mom, do you ever wish she had read it?" I looked up from my knitting. "No." She turned, brows furrowed. "I wish she had wanted to," I added. Karen sat beside me on the couch, legs crossed beneath her like she used to do as a child. She looked older these days, crow's feet just beginning to touch her eyes. But in that moment, she looked so much like Lucy, it startled me. "I've never heard it," she said softly. "The letter." "I know. Will you read it?" I hesitated. My hands twitched in my lap. The frame on the wall caught the sunlight, the glass glinting like it knew we were watching. I reached for the step stool, lifted the frame down with care, and sat with it across my knees. I hadn't opened the back since the day I sealed it, but I knew how. My fingers found the tiny latch, lifted the glass, and unfolded the letter, one slow crease at a time. The paper was fragile, but it didn't tear. It had waited a long time for this. Karen watched me, her eyes steady. I cleared my throat, surprised by the tightness there. Then I read, "Dear Mama, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but I feel scared when Walter is here. He looks at me when you're gone. Sometimes he comes into my room at night. I don't know what to do. Please, just see me. Love, Gloria." When I finished, the silence between us was not the old kind, not heavy, not punishing. It was reverent. Karen leaned back, eyes glassy. "You wrote that when you were 14. I nodded. She reached for my hand. She never read it. No, she didn't ask how I knew. She just held my hand a little tighter. "I used to think you were just quiet," she whispered. "That it was part of your nature." "It was part of my survival," I replied. We sat like that for a long time, the letter open between us. The clock ticked softly in the kitchen. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked once, then settled. Life kept moving the way it always does. "I wish I had known," Karen said. "You weren't meant to," I said. "Until now." She looked at me, eyes full of questions she didn't need to ask. Then she said the one thing I never expected. "Can I read it to Emily someday?" My breath caught. "Only if you think she's ready," I said carefully. "I do. One day, not now. But she needs to know what strength looks like." I smiled, touched and aching. "Then yes, let her hear it." I stood and walked the letter back to its frame. But this time, before I sealed it in, I slipped a second piece of paper behind it, just a small note written in my current handwriting. It said, "If you're reading this, know that your voice matters. even when it shakes, especially when it shakes. Then I closed the frame, hung it back on the wall, and stepped down slowly. Karen joined me, looking up at the letter like it was something sacred. "Mom," she said gently, "you carried that alone for so long." I nodded, but I'm not carrying it alone anymore. I left home 2 months after my 18th birthday, with 1 suitcase, 2 scholarships, and a vow I whispered to myself as the bus pulled away. No one will ever silence me again. The college was small, tucked into the hills of Vermont, with ivy-covered walls and professors who drank too much coffee and talked about the world like it could be fixed. I liked it immediately. No one there knew who Walter was. No one knew what my mother had done or failed to do. I was just Gloria Sullivan from Maine, majoring in English and trying to figure out what it meant to be free. But freedom, I quickly learned, wasn't loud. It didn't come in shouts or declarations. For me, it came in quiet things, in library corners, in soft-voiced professors, in the act of putting pen to paper without looking over my shoulder. I didn't talk much during those first semesters. Old habits take time to die. But I wrote. Pages and pages. Journals filled with things I had never dared say aloud. Essays that dripped with emotion I couldn't yet name. Stories about girls who ran, girls who stayed, girls who survived things that no one believed had happened. Professor Ellis was the first to notice. He taught Introduction to Personal Narrative and wore corduroy jackets with elbow patches. He returned my first paper with a single comment in red ink. "You've seen the world through fire. Keep writing through the smoke." I didn't know what to make of that, but I kept writing. And the more I wrote, the more I began to recognize my own voice, not the small, scared one from Hollow Pines, but the steady one I was building page by page. By junior year, I submitted a short story to the campus literary magazine. It was fiction, technically, but it was about a girl named Anna whose mother didn't read her letter. The girl left home with a broken heart and a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. She found solace in books, strength in silence, and healing in telling the truth, even if no one else wanted to hear it. The story was published under a pseudonym. I remember standing in the hallway outside the journalism office, holding the magazine in my hands, heart pounding. I didn't tell anyone it was mine. I just read the pages over and over, letting the words settle in my bones. Later that night, I sat on my dorm room bed and cried. Not because I was sad, but because it was the first time I felt seen. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't justice, but it was something. It was survival turned into language. I never went home that summer. I worked at the campus library shelving books and running the front desk. I liked the quiet, the way time passed without expectation. I liked the feel of the card catalog drawers and the scent of worn pages. I liked that no one asked me to explain myself. One afternoon in July, a little girl came in with her father. She was maybe 6, missing her 2 front teeth, and insisted on checking out a book on butterflies all by myself. She marched up to the desk chin high and said, "I can spell my name. Want me to show you?" I smiled. "Absolutely." She spelled it out letter by letter, and I stamped her card with a flourish. "Now it's real," I said. She grinned, grabbed her book, and ran back to her father. I sat back in my chair, something warm blooming in my chest. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a line I hadn't dared before. I was never weak. I was just waiting for a place to be strong. That sentence would become the first line of my senior thesis, a collection of personal essays about girlhood, silence, and becoming. I dedicated it to every voice that was ever told to hush. When I graduated in 1964, I wore my cap low and my smile wide. Mama didn't come to the ceremony. I hadn't expected her to. But in my purse, folded into my wallet behind my ID and bus pass, was the letter. Still creased, still mine. Still unread by the one who mattered most. But that day, for the first time, I realized maybe I was the one who needed to read it all along. Some nights, when the house is still and my knees ache from standing too long, I sit in my chair by the fireplace and imagine what it might have been like if she had read it. Not the real version where she found the letter, crushed it in her fist, and slapped me for writing it. No. That version I've lived with long enough. This one is different. Softer. Warmer. Not because it happened, but because I need it to. In this version, I picture her coming home from the hospital that night, her shoes wet from snow, her coat damp at the hem. She reaches into her pocket for a pen and pulls out the folded note. She pauses. She feels the weight of it. She notices my handwriting on the front, and this time she opens it. She reads slowly, her eyes scanning each line. In this version, she doesn't slam a cupboard or yell my name. She doesn't rush to defend herself or him. She simply walks down the hallway into my room and sits at the edge of my bed. I imagine myself sitting up terrified, and I imagine her voice not hard, not angry, but quiet, like wind rustling through curtains. I didn't know, she says. I didn't see it. But I believe you. Just those words. Simple. Enough. She reaches out and takes my hand. She doesn't let go. I cry not because I'm scared, but because I'm safe. Because I've been seen. In this version, she goes to the police. She throws Walter out. She tells the neighbors, the church, the world if she has to. Not for revenge, but to show me that love doesn't ignore pain. That a mother protects even when it's inconvenient. Of course it didn't happen that way. But at 80 years old, I've learned something important. Sometimes healing isn't about rewriting what happened. It's about imagining what should have happened and letting that vision hold your hand when no one else did. Last week, Karen asked if she could make a copy of the letter. For Emily, she said. Someday. I nodded. But I added something too. I wrote a second letter, one I signed not as a daughter, but as a mother. It said, Dear Emily, if you're ever scared, if someone ever hurts you, if the world tells you to be quiet, come to me. I will listen. I will believe you. Love, Grandma Gloria. I don't know if she'll ever need it. I hope she never will. But if she does, I want her to have something I didn't. A voice that answers. A hand that reaches back. That night, after Karen had gone, I made a cup of tea and sat in the living room, just me and the framed letter. I closed my eyes, and I imagined my mother's voice again, not from memory, but from mercy. This time, she said, I'm sorry, baby. I didn't read it, but I should have. And I should have believed you. I opened my eyes. There was no one there, just the soft glow of the lamp, the ticking of the clock, and the sound of water settling in the kettle. But it was enough. I whispered, I forgive you. And the silence in the room didn't hurt anymore. It just listened. Emily was 10 the first time she saw the letter. It was a Sunday in late September. The leaves outside were just starting to turn crisp reds and golds, painting the streets like a quilt. Karen had brought Emily over for lunch, a habit we'd started a year prior. Nothing fancy, just tuna melts, carrot sticks, and sometimes a slice of apple pie if I'd remembered to bake. That afternoon, while Karen and I talked in the kitchen, Emily wandered into the living room. I heard her small voice call out, Grandma, what's that in the frame? I turned, wiping my hands on a towel. She was pointing to the letter. I hesitated. For a moment, I considered brushing it off, calling it just something old or a memory from when I was young. But I didn't. Instead, I walked over, sat beside her on the couch, and looked up at the frame. That, I said, is a letter I wrote when I was a little older than you are now. Emily's eyes widened. Did you mail it? No, I said gently. I gave it to someone I loved, but they never opened it. She turned to me curious. Why not? I smiled, not a happy smile, but the kind that holds weight. Sometimes people don't open things they know will hurt, even if reading them might have helped. Emily thought about that. I could see her chewing on the idea like a question she wasn't quite sure how to shape. Then she asked, what did it say? I looked at her. My granddaughter. Freckles across her nose. A wobbly braid. Too young to carry pain, but not too young to understand it exists. I spoke slowly. It said I was scared, that something wasn't right, and that I needed someone to believe me. She blinked. Did they believe you later? I paused. No, but I learned to believe myself. She was quiet for a while, her fingers tracing the stitching on the pillow beside her. Then she asked, "Is that why you always listen when I talk? Even when I talk too much?" I smiled again, this time lighter. "Yes, because no voice is ever too much." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Then in that way, only a child can she change the subject entirely. "Can I have a cookie?" I laughed. "Yes, you can have two, but only if you help me rinse the dishes first." She dashed into the kitchen to bargain with her mom, and I stayed there on the couch looking up at the frame. The words were the same as ever. But now, they lived in a different house. A house with space, a house with warmth. A house where the next generation didn't have to grow up wondering if they would be believed. Later that night, after they had left and the lights were off, I sat in my chair and replayed her voice. "Is that why you always listen when I talk?" Such a small question, such a big answer. It reminded me of something I had written years ago, but never shared. The most powerful gift you can give a child is to believe their whispers before they learn how to scream. That night, I added a new piece of paper behind the frame, folded and taped, gently tucked just beneath the letter. It said, "Emily asked about you today," and I answered. That's something I never thought I'd say. We drove to Hollow Pines on a quiet Tuesday morning in October. The trees had gone wild with color amber and crimson dancing along the roadside. Emily sat beside me in the passenger seat, her sneakers swinging above the floor mat, clutching a notebook I'd given her just in case she wanted to write something. She hadn't asked where we were going. Not exactly. She just said, "Can we take a trip, just the two of us?" And I said yes. The town hadn't changed much. The bakery still stood on the corner now under a different name. The library had new glass doors. But the streets felt the same narrow, familiar, holding memories like old drawers hold loose buttons. I turned onto Bellamy Street, slowing as the house came into view. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had chipped. The porch sagged. The old maple tree out front was still there, though its branches reached wider now, casting shadows over the walkway. Emily leaned forward. "Is this it?" "Yes," I said, my voice soft. "This is where I grew up." She stared out the window, silent. Then, without asking, she unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed out. I followed. We stood on the sidewalk, wind brushing our faces. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "What happened here?" I closed my eyes and took a breath, and I told her, not all at once, not in a dramatic rush, but slowly, piece by piece, like I was unwrapping a story I had folded too many times. I told her about the letter, about the man named Walter, about the silence, about the night the clock stopped ticking. I told her how I left, how I found my voice in writing, how I carried that letter through 8 decades like a lantern in the dark. Emily listened without interrupting. Her eyes were fixed on the front steps of the house, as if trying to see the girl I once was. When I finished, she turned to me. "Did anyone ever say they were sorry?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "But I did. To myself. Eventually." She nodded slowly, then looked up at the porch again. "Can we go up there?" I hesitated. I hadn't stepped foot on that porch since the day I left for college. But something about the way she asked, gentle, curious, not afraid, made me say yes. We walked up the path, the gravel crunching beneath our shoes. The steps groaned under our weight. Emily reached for the old doorbell, but I stopped her. "No one lives here now," I said. "The house was sold years ago. It's been empty since last fall." She glanced at me. "Then it's okay to sit for a minute." I smiled. "Just a minute." We sat on the edge of the porch, shoulder to shoulder. "I wish she had read it," Emily whispered. "I do too," I said. "But if she had, I might not have found my voice the way I did." She was quiet for a while. Then she pulled her notebook from her backpack, opened to a fresh page, and handed it to me. "Can you write it again?" she asked. "The letter." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to hear you say it. Out loud. Like it matters." Tears stung my eyes, but I nodded. I took the pen, stared at the page, and wrote, "Dear Mama, I was scared. I needed you. You didn't come, but I found my way anyway. Love, Gloria." Emily watched me write, her breath steady. When I finished, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "That's a good letter," she said. "It only took me 65 years to finish it," I replied. We sat there a while longer, letting the porch remember us. Before we left, Emily took a photo of the house with her little camera. For the scrapbook, she said. Of course I smiled. Let's call it Where We Begin Again. The letter hangs in my bedroom now. After we returned from Hollow Pines, Emily helped me move it. She said it belonged closer to where your story ends. Grandma, not where it started. I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The living room was where I used to explain myself. The bedroom is where I don't have to. She picked the spot right above the bookshelf near the window. It catches morning light here, she said. It'll shine like it matters. And so it does. Some mornings, I sit in my rocker with my tea staring at that worn paper behind the glass. The ink has faded some. The folds are more pronounced, but it's still legible. Still mine. Sometimes I wonder who else might see it one day. A nurse, maybe, if I end up needing care. A neighbor's child. A curious visitor. I hope they ask about it. I hope they stay long enough to hear the story, not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. A few weeks ago, Emily came over with a school project. We're doing presentations on something brave, she said. And I want to talk about you. I blinked. Me, yes. But, can I read the letter? Not the real one, just a copy. And maybe talk about why it matters. I sat very still. Why does it matter to you? I asked her gently. She paused, thoughtful. Then said, because you didn't get believed, but you kept going anyway? That's brave. And because you believe me even when I just feel small. My throat tightened. I nodded. Then yes, you can read it, and you can tell them why it matters. She smiled, then ran off to fetch her markers and glue sticks. That night, when the house was quiet, I opened my drawer and took out the envelope I keep tucked beneath my scarves. Inside is a clean copy of the letter, the one I wrote at 14, and a small note in Emily's handwriting that simply says, "Your voice helped mine grow." I added a third note to the envelope, one I wrote just for her. Dear Emily, one day you may be afraid. You may wonder if your voice is too soft, your truth too inconvenient. It's not. Speak anyway. And if you ever need someone to listen, you already know where to find me. I sealed it with gentle hands and tied the envelope with blue ribbon. That will be her letter someday. The one she didn't have to write alone. As I sit here now, 80 years old, windows open to the fall breeze, I realize I no longer need to rehearse the past. I no longer need to rewrite endings or imagine apologies that never came. The silence that once haunted me has turned into space. Room for new stories. Room for girls like Emily, who won't have to fold their words 3 times and hide them in coat pockets. Room for truth to hang where it belongs on the wall in the light with nothing left to hide. And when I'm gone, I hope they leave the frame there. Let the letter stay. Let it remind anyone who reads it. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. There's something tender about a letter that was never read, how it still carries the weight of a voice that refused to stay silent. Gloria's journey reminds us that even when no one listens, even when the truth is buried or ignored, the act of speaking is sacred. Her letter didn't change the past, but it shaped the future for herself, for her daughter, and for a little girl named Emily, who will grow up knowing that her voice has power. In this life, healing doesn't always come from being heard. Sometimes it comes from speaking anyway. And sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to believe in the whispers of a child before they learn to scream. If this story touched you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Was there ever a moment you needed someone to listen? Let's make space for each other, for truth, and for voices that once shook but never broke. And if you believe stories like Gloria's matter, please consider subscribing or sharing this episode with someone who may need to hear it. Because every voice matters, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones.